We're going to continue our discussion of our ABCs by talking about a concept called cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions are a fancy word also known as automatic negative thoughts, otherwise known as ANTs. If you recall our ABC and CBT audio, we talked about our thoughts, our feelings, and our behavior. And the basic premise was that our thoughts connected to our feelings, and our feelings created our behavior. In other words, what we're saying here is that we are the ones that create our level of upset by how we think about things, how we perceive our situation, and how we believe things ought to or should be. And so what we're talking about here is faulty thinking or cognitive distortions. But before we move on, let's just review what we talked about when we talked about our ABCs. We talked about A being the activating event or the action or experience, B being our beliefs and thoughts and attitudes about A, and C being the consequences of your beliefs. And they could be emotional, that is, you might be upset, you might be happy, you might be sad. They can be behavioral, that is, he slammed his fist on the desk, he stomped out of the office. Or they can be physiological, like, you have butterflies that you might feel in your stomach before making a speech, or the headache that you get after a terrible day. So A is the action or the event, B our belief, and C are our consequences, which can be emotional, behavioral, or physiological. And we can decipher any situation or circumstance or issue that we are struggling with using this information. If you take a look in the handout section of Module 3, you will see a handout that walks you through this process. And I would encourage you to take a situation that you are struggling with and decipher it using the ABC model. Now, what happens if we add another letter to our ABC model and we add the letter D? Well, when we add the letter D, what we are doing is we are disputing our thinking. Our thinking may be irrational, it may be faulty, we might have stinking thoughts. And when we use the letter D, we're beginning to dispute our thinking. And we can dispute our thinking by some of the techniques that we've talked about previously, the Byron-Katie technique. Asking ourselves, is it true? We can look at the pros and cons of our thinking. We can stop and ask ourselves, I'm thinking this way, I'm talking to myself this way. Is this the way that I would talk to my best friend? Or another way that we can dispute our faulty thinking is we can move from a position of being negative to more of a position of being neutral. So you can simply replace your thinking or your irrational thoughts by disputing them. And D is a form of reprogramming your brain with a more functional thinking style. So A is our activating event, B the belief or perception, C are the consequences, and they can be emotional, behavioral, physiological, and D is our disputing of those irrational or dysfunctional thoughts and beliefs. So let's move on and get back to cognitive distortions. What exactly are cognitive distortions? Well, they are unhelpful, exaggerated, irrational thought patterns that cause us to perceive a situation or circumstance inaccurately, irrationally, thereby reinforcing negative and feelings of upset. Another way of thinking about them is that they are faulty errors in our thinking that cause us to exaggerate, minimize, misinterpret, magnify, personalize other people's words and actions so that we either see ourselves as being superior to them or we see ourselves as victims or inferior to them. So what they say or did is what causes us to be angry and upset, and in some cases aggressive. And we'll talk more about that a little bit further on when we talk about the specific cognitive distortions. So cognitive distortions are considered to be habitual patterns of thinking because if we consistently think in these ways, these thoughts become automatic and almost become entrenched pathways or roads in the brain, and they become our habits. And our habits then become core beliefs from which we now operate from. If these patterns are so deeply entrenched in our brains, we not only have to change our ways of thinking, but we also have to intervene on more deeper levels. And when you move on to Module 4, we'll talk about the different ways that you can intervene using your subconscious mind. So there are at least 12 to 15 different types of cognitive distortions, depending on whatever book on CBT that you read. I'm going to explain the 5 most common ones that are the most likely to lead you to feelings of being upset and lead you to feelings of being angry. So our first cognitive distortion, and I think the most important one, is blaming. You are responsible for the problem. It's your fault. You need to fix the problem. You're to blame. I think blaming is one of the most destructive and damaging distortions that we have, because we're feeling that other people are doing bad things to you and that they are doing it on purpose. And it may make you feel better in the moment, but it leaves you helpless in the long run. Why? Because you're giving away your power. You're waiting for the other person to change and do something about your pain. And of course, they never do. Or they do it in their own time. And that's going to reinforce your anger, your resentment, your sense of frustration, and lead to your sense of helplessness. Blame takes away your personal sense of responsibility and causes you to lose your locus of control. And here's a really nice quote here by John Burroughs. A man can fail many times, but he isn't a failure until he begins to blame someone else. There you have it. Distortion number 1, blaming. Our second cognitive distortion is demanding, or otherwise known as commanding. And this is where you are forcing or insisting someone else act or feel the same way that you do about an issue. Your opinions and feelings are the right ones. No one else's counts. And those people that do exercise the right to feel differently from you, then there's something wrong with them. And if you look at these pictures, you will see a number of dictators. And that's exactly that. Another word for demanding could be dictatorship. And again, you operate with strong shoulds and musts, and you believe that your morals and rules are the right ones and they are the only ones. And so when we think demanding, we're thinking Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, those dictators. So that really is cognitive distortion number 2, demanding. Global labeling. You always forget to put out the garbage. You are completely selfish. You never put the kids to bed. So when we use global labels, we consistently think in absolutes, and we make inflammatory global labels and statements about other people. And there are labels about what other people are doing that we don't like. He's a jerk. He's an idiot. Loser. Asshole. She's a bitch. And here the label paints the person as being totally worthless, totally bad, or totally wrong. And that fuels our anger and our, because what we're doing is we are objectifying the person. You're impersonalizing them. You now see them as worthless objects. And I would say to you, if you are in a discussion with somebody and that discussion elevates to an argument, if you stop and step back and unravel that discussion, you will see that it probably got off track because somebody used a global label. Always, never, completely. Or somebody labeled that person as in a way that that person felt worthless, bad, or wrong. So global labels, that's another serious cognitive distortion. And just to add to that, when you use global labels, you're thinking in very polarized ways. You're thinking in terms of black and white. There's no gray area. And you're thinking in terms of all or nothing, either or, good or bad. They're global labels. Okay? Our next cognitive distortion is mind reading, also called misattributions. And this is where you assume that you know what someone else is thinking or feeling, and you jump to conclusions based on your interpretation of what you think somebody else is experiencing or feeling. You're mind reading. So they did it on purpose. You assume that you know the other person's real motives for doing what it is that they did. That, they are deliberately out to get you. Even though there may be other explanations for their actions, you still see it as a personal vendetta against you. You cannot entertain the fact that you could be partially wrong or that there could be another explanation for what happened. It's all about you. Another form of mind reading is fortune telling, where you strongly predict the future. You know for sure what is going to happen down the road. And of course, you don't. So there you have mind reading and fortune telling. Our last cognitive distortion is magnifying. And this is where you turn a small problem into a molehill. You sweat the small stuff. You get caught up in minutia. You get caught up in the insignificant stuff. Magnifying can also be known as catastrophizing. In other words, you see every single thing at a level 10. The dog has run away or has gone for a walk. Somebody left the door open and the dog went out. No, the dog knows his way around the neighborhood. He's going to come back home. But for you, it is the end of the world. And you are calling your husband, you're calling your son, you're calling your daughter, you're calling everybody because it's such a catastrophe. Okay, so as you can see, magnifying, you use up a lot of energy because everything is seen at a level 10. You extrapolate a bad situation and you really run with it. You see things as awful, as terrible, as horrendous, and you see your distorted interpretation of an event as being the actual facts. That is magnifying. As we did with our A, B, C, and D exercise, the way to deal with our cognitive distortions is to simply replace them. Replace them with more realistic, rational coping thoughts. Thoughts that allow us to reframe and to see our situation more realistically and rationally. Only then do we become empowered and really in control of how we feel and how we act. There you have it, cognitive distortions.